Why Isn't My Strategic Planning Working will be presented by Robert Bradford, President and CEO of the Center for Simplified Strategic Planning. He is the author of the bestseller, Simplified Strategic Planning, a no-nonsense guide for busy people who want results fast.
Also presenting with me is Denise Harrison, the COO of the Center for Simplified Strategic Planning and author of Innovation, Where to Find It. We will have a short question and answer session at the end. However, if you'd like to ask questions anytime during the program, feel free to enter them into the question or chat boxes in the right-hand screen on the GoToMeeting page. So I'd like to start by talking about what we don't like about strategic planning, because if you feel your strategic planning is not working, there's probably one of these three things or four things going on for you. First of all, it's mushy. It doesn't necessarily connect to anything in your work or in reality. That's a big problem people mention. Also, people talk about our plan being too big, often too voluminous. It takes up a large binder or too many pages, and you just don't want to look at it because it's so big. Also, we hear people say it's time-consuming, that they spend too long on their strategic planning. And a very common answer we get is that we don't get results from our strategic plan. Now, all of these are serious problems. We're going to address each one of these in some depth and talk about ways you can handle it. So what we get from our strategic planning includes, I think, 5 basic things. There's direction. It shows you where you're going, which is very important, because if you don't have that nailed down, you're probably going to end up somewhere else. Secondly, it gives you a sense of focus, and we'll talk about why focus is so important in a bit. It also creates movement, that things actually happen. If your strategic planning and execution are done well, it actually does link to reality. And it should also lead to the last 2 items, which are the main reason why I think most people do strategic planning, is it improves your profit and growth, especially profitability and growthability. So why don't our plans deliver these things? There are 4 things that we're going to talk about today that relate to this, and those 4 things are a poor process. That is, the process doesn't really give you the results or the horsepower you're looking for. Poor implementation, that you don't do what you say you're going to do in your plans. A lack of differentiation, which means you come up with a plan that looks just like everyone else's, and that's a recipe for disaster. And then finally, a lack of focus in your planning, which is something that most people say they don't want to do, but when you get down to it, actually focusing can be very difficult for people. So before we get into talking about a few of these things in detail, I want to talk about my basic philosophy about what strategic planning is all about. And I like to use this picture to sort of visualize it. In strategic planning, we want to take a look at where you are today and have a very firm sense of where you are, what your resources are, what your strengths and weaknesses are. And then we have to take a look at the environmental variables that you're going to have to steer through to get to become the company you want to be in the future. And those variables can include things like technology, your markets, your competition, and so on. So strategic planning is about understanding where you are today, understanding the environment you have to steer through, and then laying out a vision of what you want to look like in the future. And then to create your execution, to do that well, you have to have a set of actions that are integrated, that they're compatible with each other, and that push your organization in the direction that you want to go, because that's actually where we get the traction out of our planning. So when we look at the process, which is the first problem that people have, I like to think in terms of what's a bad process look like, what's a good process look like. If your process is bad, it may be too short, but it may be time-consuming. So those first 2 bad process items are actually diametrically opposed to each other. Some people spend too little time, and they should spend the right amount of time. And some people spend too much time because they're trying to digest everything in their strategic plan. So you want to spend the right amount of time, not too little time, but you want to make sure your process is also designed to be efficient and not waste your time. The third thing we want to look at is where the focus is. Your focus in a lot of bad strategic planning is on buzzwords. A lot of people who do strategic planning read a book or 2 about strategic planning, and then they go out and they spout all these things, and they're not focused on reality, which is really where your strategic planning should be focused. The fourth thing is a lot of people will come up with laundry lists. When you look at, for example, the classic SWOT analysis, where you do strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a lot of people come up with laundry lists, very long lists of strengths and weaknesses, very long list of opportunities and threats, and they get bogged down in. And the reality is you want to focus on the critical items. So I like to force people to choose what they think the most important things that are going on now in those areas are, rather than come up with a huge laundry list. Also, a bad process can be very number-driven. I think there's a real utility to numbers in some places, but if it's all number-driven, your strategic planning process can start to just look like a budgeting process or a process of developing an income projection for the coming 5 years. And a really good strategic planning process should be much more focused on the strategy. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? Is much more important than getting all of the numbers exactly right. And finally, in bad processes, we often see companies do strategic planning with a business leader running this. And the business leader, especially if you're talking about the CEO of an organization, that person should really be thinking about the content of your strategy and not the process of strategic planning. So a good process should have a process leader who's responsible for keeping the ball rolling and keeping it efficient, so that the key people who have to think about the real strategy are, instead of worrying about the process, they're really worried about where the organization is going. So one of the ways we do this in Simplified Strategic Planning, if you've read that book, you're certainly aware that we view the processes as flowing from a foundation of data and ideas down, narrowing down the ideas into analysis, using that to develop direction, using that to develop commitment, and finally using that to develop implementation. So part of the design of the process that we like to use is to start with the general and move toward the specific, so that you waste less time on arguments. If you start with specific conclusions, it's very, very difficult to get people to agree, and it's also time-consuming to get people to agree on the specific answers. If you start by building agreement around the underlying information and then the analysis and then the direction, each step in the process will bring people closer and closer to having their thinking on the same page, and that's a much more productive process design than many people use. The other thing I'd like to talk about that's referred to in Simplified Strategic Planning is something we call the tension triangle. In the tension triangle, what we're really trying to identify is that every organization has sources of tension that are largely, they may be internal, but they are dealing with the reality that you live in your world. So those sources of tension are sales and marketing, the customers and what they want. That causes tension for us. We have to do something to handle what they want. Finance, of course, money is always a tension because there never seems to be enough of it. And then operations, just the reality of what you do means that you can't be in 6 places at once. You can't sell a product that you haven't made yet, and a lot of things like that. And those are realities that you can't shortcut around. And all 3 of the points on this triangle have realities that will tend to create tension, and you can alleviate that tension by pushing the tension into another part of the organization. So one of the process issues a lot of organizations run into is that instead of resolving the tension, coming up with something that takes the whole level of tension down, the strategic planning process becomes a fight between people in different corners of this triangle, where they're just trying to push the tension out of their corner into somebody else's corner. And that actually doesn't help the organization. It's actually possibly very destructive. So you want to avoid that if you want an efficient process in your strategic planning. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about was vagueness and the mushiness in the process. Although I said number-driven planning is a bad idea, I think you want to drive to numbers to avoid vagueness in your planning process. And by that I mean ask people to make assumptions with numbers, ask people to make estimates with numbers, and in some cases where there may be disagreement about certain items, take things that are not necessarily numeric and ask people to put them on a scale, because that driving to numbers will help you build agreement, build an understanding of where people think things are going on, what levels of issues people think you're having in your organization. You also want to do the second thing here, which is understand the disagreements. Some of those disagreements are going to come because you're at different points on the tension triangle that I just talked about. Some of them may come because people have different experiences or different data that they're basing their decisions on. You want to make sure you get those ironed out. And understand that the disagreements are rarely because one person is smart and the other one's stupid. Often the disagreements are because people have different sets of information and different perspectives. However, this leads me to my third thing, that people who talk like that they're trying to build consensus, and I think consensus is a great thing, but don't seek perfect consensus on everything. Almost every great decision that you're going to make is going to leave one or two people on your team a little uncomfortable. In fact, if it doesn't make people uncomfortable, you may not be pushing yourself hard enough. So try to avoid seeking consensus, because when you do, you try to create this big tent or this big umbrella that covers all of the ideas in the room, and you may come up with something so vague and mushy and vanilla flavored that it doesn't actually do anything for you strategically. The fourth thing you want to do is embrace accountability, and when we talk about embracing accountability, that means that everybody in the room is going to take responsibility for doing the things that you say you're going to do in the strategy, and you're going to take that strategy and make it work. And the group involved in your strategic planning should understand that they are responsible for its success or failure. The third or fifth thing I want you to think about is having SMART objectives. We have found in our strategic planning practice that people who write very specific, measurable, and that's what SMART stands for, specific, measurable, achievable result with a time deadline. If you write an objective that way, it's much more likely to be implemented, because you're creating a very solid, understandable set point that everybody is driving towards in their execution, and that will help your execution. And then finally, to support that, very specific action plans that detail who is going to do what, when, and actually allocates resources to the actions required for execution. So all of those things are necessary. A lot of people find these things are somewhat tedious in practice, and so they avoid them. But I've got to tell you, when you skip over some of these, my sense is you're damaging the validity of your whole strategy. So do avoid those problems. So now I'd like to turn the screen over to Denise, and Denise will talk to you about implementation.
Sometimes I find CEOs are really frustrated because they've come up with a really great strategy. They've got a lot of motivation on the team, and there's buy-in. But then at the end of the year, they really don't see significant progress into achieving the strategy. And this implementation is where a lot of strategic plans fall down. So it's how do you take that big picture and turn that into strategic objectives? And so to reiterate, you need to be forcing your conclusions based on facts rather than opinions. Because if people feel like they've made decisions based on facts rather than what somebody thought that day, you'll find that your implementation will stay on track. And as you lead strategic planning, you'll be thinking about and deciding on the few objectives, strategic objectives that you want to focus on in order to get closer to where you want to go. And I'm thinking that number should be 6 to 10. When people take on more than that, they will not be able to achieve their objectives because it's too much to really manage on a strategic level. So it's important that you have the 6 to 10, so they're just a few, and that those objectives, as Robert has already mentioned, are SMART, with the focus on the result rather than the action. Too many action plans are focused on, here are the things we're going to do, rather than we're doing these things to focus on a specific result, to achieve a certain amount of revenue at a certain amount of profitability. Action plans. Action plans are the roadmaps that allow you to achieve that objective. And you know what it's like to get directions from somebody who said, oh yeah, you go down a couple lights, you make a left, go over the hill, make a right, and it should be right there on your left. That's a totally different plan than someone says, you go 2 miles, make a right, then you're going to go 4.5 miles, make a left, and then you're going to pass a brown building on your right, and it'll be the building after that. Those specific roadmaps allow you to get where you want to go a lot more accurately, and with those specific action steps, you can specifically assign who's responsible so that there's no question about who's going to accomplish the step and how much time and how much money it will take. And these action plans allow you to allocate your resources and first see if you've taken on too much. So balance that day to day, because you still have to run your business daily, with your strategic, and make sure you haven't bitten off more than you can chew. And so one of the keys to implementation is selecting those few strategic objectives, making sure you have clear roadmaps and understand the resourcing. But there's another step that's important, and that is monitoring. Monitoring makes sure that you keep things on track and make sure that your strategic objectives have visibility and they don't get sidetracked due to the day-to-day urgencies of the business. Monitoring means that you have monthly meetings to review your progress on strategic initiatives. Key to these meetings, you will discuss what happened in the last month and make commitments for what needs to happen in the coming month or months. Once you have that commitment, everyone has once again raised the visibility of your strategic objectives, and you have commitment as to what needs to happen in this next month moving forward. It's important for these monitoring meetings to keep everything on track, but there's one other important aspect of a monitoring meeting. And that is, these are the meetings where if business conditions have changed, you can then make changes into your strategic plan. So if there's a segment that is no longer attractive because there's been a change in economic circumstances, and you've got an action plan that's going to really develop your market share in that segment that's no longer attractive, well, don't keep allocating those resources to an unattractive segment. Make the change, pull that action plan off, and get a new one on. So all of these things require commitment. So it's understanding that you need to take that big picture and get it down into the details that will make it happen. It's making sure you're focusing on a few objectives and making sure those objectives are focused on results, making sure you have clear roadmaps, and then monitor to make sure you stay on track, making course corrections where necessary. All of this requires commitment. Next, I'd like to transition into differentiation. So why do your customers choose your company over the competition? And where do you have that significant competitive advantage? This should be a key discussion in your strategic planning efforts. If you're not having this discussion, chances are you're going to follow the crowd. So segmentation, and that's one of the key areas where you start really looking for your differentiation. So many companies that I work with look at their strategic planning initially the way everyone else in the industry looks at their segmentation. And if you look at the customers the way everybody else does, chances are you're going to miss the underlying niches that might be there, or have a better understanding of those market needs, and then analyze how do you meet those needs, and how do you get that competitive advantage. So looking for the ways unique segmentation will often allow you to better focus your resources and uncover unmet needs and growth areas in the marketplace. Let me give you 2 examples. I was brought in to run a financial services company, a clearinghouse. And when I was brought in to turn the company around. And I asked about their segmentation. And their segmentation was, well, we've got the small customers, we've got the medium customers, and we've got the large customers. So I said, well, what's the difference between the small and the medium customers? Well, the medium customers do more. And I asked, well, and the large customers, would it be that those do even more? Sure enough, the difference was just based on volume. Now, sometimes that might be a good segmentation, but as I learned more about the marketplace, I found the customers really had different buying behavior, and they could be segmented differently. First, there was a group of customers that wanted everything accurate, and they were willing to pay for it. Now, as a clearinghouse, basically we were just moving money from one place to another, and you'd kind of think that this group would be pretty large, and it was. And the good news was we were tops in accuracy. The bad news is it cost some money to do that, so we weren't the cheapest in the marketplace. Then there was another segment of customers. This was the group that wanted financial security. They wanted to be with a clearinghouse that they were sure was going to be stable. And one of my competitors was an 800-pound gorilla. They were a division of a Fortune 500 company, and because they were a division, people saw them as being very financially stable. The reason why these customers were so risk-averse was that several years ago, one of the clearinghouses had gone bankrupt. And when a clearinghouse goes bankrupt, any money that they're holding for you disappears. And so customers had lost millions of dollars when this clearinghouse went out of business. So in order to compete in this financial security, the people who really wanted you to be financially secure, we were able to do a couple things. We were a privately held company, so we didn't share our financial information, so that was a detriment. But we would allow potential customers to talk to our bank and talk to our accountants so that they would have a good feeling for our security. For some of the customers, that was enough. They became customers of ours, and they were happy with our accuracy and willing to pay more. For some customers, they needed to see our financial statements, and that meant they weren't going to be customers of ours. Now notice, it didn't matter if we were high or low price, because we could lower prices for this type of customer all we wanted. They still would not come to us unless they were happy with our accountant's comments and our banking and talking to our banking representatives. So it wasn't about price. And then there was the third group, and these were the people who did focus on price, and frankly, if they were focused on price, we were probably not the right company for them. So rather than doing the big dog and pony shows that we had been doing in the past, we would send in a quote and send in one of our salespeople, but we wouldn't do the big presentations and spend all that time. We would send in the quote just to make sure we kept our competitors in there with their low prices and to make sure they didn't make progress in gaining more pricing power, but we didn't spend a lot of time. So you can see how this new segmentation strategy allowed us to truly focus our resources on the customers who really liked us for the accuracy, even though it was higher price, or were comfortable with the financial information we were able to provide to them through our accountants and banks, but not to focus on the people who wanted low price or the people who were not happy unless they saw our financial statements. This new focus allowed us to be much more profitable and focus in the areas where we would get results. Let me tell you another segmentation. I worked with a team who segmented in the normal way, you know, the automotive sector, they had the aerospace sector, the consumer product sector, the pharmaceutical sector, and on and on. And their strategy looked a lot like other people's strategy within this segment. We looked at segmenting in a number of different ways, and we finally settled on, let's look at how our systems are being used. So look at them by applications. And we were providing systems for engineers. So the big applications were in the rapid prototyping. Some were for fast design and some were actually for functional prototypes. But we found as we actually looked at how our systems were being used, we uncovered two niches. One was our systems were being used for manufacturing tools. These were things like quality gauges that were used in the manufacturing process where you could test to see if things were in tolerance. We also used in making jigs, fixtures, and patterns. And then we found in some cases we were actually being used to manufacture the end product. We found that by looking at these niches, there were different needs and preferences. They needed greater reliability. They needed different materials to run on our system. When we figured out these niches that our competitors hadn't looked at, it enabled us to grow during 2008 and 2009 when the recession first hit, because we had uncovered an area, and by exploring that area and developing that area in other companies, we had growth in our high systems end, the profitable segment of our business. And this was very beneficial as we entered the recession. So that's the power of looking at differentiation and looking at segmentation. What do we have that differentiates us in a market, and do we really understand the markets that we're serving, and what is that true segmentation? Another key area for differentiation is strategic competency. What is the intellectual capital that sets you apart in the marketplace? And that is also key to the area of focus. And Robert Bradford's going to take us through the focus and strategic competencies.
So finding focus presents us with some challenges. And the first challenge in finding focus is accepting reality. If you can't be honest about where your strengths and weaknesses are, if you can't be honest about where you really are able to set yourself apart and where you're pretty much in the same hack as everybody else in your markets, it's very, very difficult to really get to a good spot for focus. The other reality we have to accept is that every organization has finite resources. We would love to be able to take a $10 million company and focus on a $10 billion business, but the reality is if you try to do that, you're going to get your clock cleaned by people who have a lot more resources than you do, who are a lot more interested in that larger business because they're already big and already have a lot of resources. So we want to do the second thing here, which is match our focus to our resources. Smaller companies should seek slightly smaller targets and markets to dominate. Large companies need large markets to dominate. And if a small company spends too much time on a large market, they usually can make some progress and then have the whole thing snatched away from them if they don't have some trick up their sleeve. And if a large company focuses on too small a market, you've got exactly the opposite problem going on. One of the other keys to focus is this third item here, which is the power of not doing things. When we talk about not doing things, what we're saying is focus isn't just about the thing you're focusing on. It's about not thinking about all of the things that you're not focusing on. And this can be very, very difficult, especially for those of you who maybe are attracted by bright, shiny objects. So we want to make sure that when we focus, we understand that it means there are some things we're not going to do, even if they're good things, even if they'd be positive, and for a business, even if they'd be profitable. But the fourth thing we want to think about is focusing based on competency. Now, competency is a strange creature. Your competencies are know-how that's inside your organization or in you maybe, but it's knowledge-based. It's stuff that's in your brain. And the thing that's important about that is unlike any other asset you have, the more you use competency, the more it appreciates. All of your other assets depreciate with use, but competency actually appreciates with use. So you learn to do something really well. And this is the underpinning of something I call the Island of Profitability concept. And the way I'd like you to visualize this is I've got a little three-dimensional graph here, and you just want to think about the vertical dimension in the graph that you see in front of you as your profitability. But the other dimensions could be anything. It could be actually a physical location, the closer it is to a certain spot, but it could be the closer it is to what you're really good at. So, for example, when I talk about Walt Disney Company, they're very good at family entertainment. Their island of profitability is defined by that, and the farther away from family entertainment they get in anything they do, they can still make it work because they have a lot of resources, but it gets less profitable for them because they don't bring nearly as much know-how to the table as they do when they're focused on family entertainment. And you can see that focus doesn't restrict them from growth. They've grown in, from just a movie company to having television and theme parks and hotels and cruise lines and retail and all kinds of different businesses, but they stayed focused in the one dimension that was important to you. So a lot of your strategic planning discussion should be about understanding what dimensions underlie the focus that you should really be using to drive your business's profitability. This relates very directly to something that I'll ask Denise to talk about, which is when we want to create focus, we want to build an ongoing process for managing around this and make sure that we don't get distracted on an ongoing basis. So Denise, if you could talk about the strategic management process, that'd be cool.
So we've talked about strategic planning, and we find that, as Robert mentioned earlier, that if you gather information first and come to agreement and understand your capabilities and your competencies, and you develop a strategic plan based on that, you're going to end up with a 3 to 5 year vision of your company, and you're going to have a lot of agreement there because people are basing their decisions based on fact versus opinions. But it's important to drive it then to the execution by establishing goals and objectives and action plans so that you have clear roadmaps. So if you stop at the planning stage, you will only achieve 30 to 40% of your objectives because you're not driving to that execution where you've got those detailed roadmaps and you're actually doing what it is you set out to do and focusing on those key initiatives that are most important to get you where you want to go. If you focus on that execution, you'll achieve 70% of your objectives. And if you then monitor your developments and progress, having those monthly meetings to make sure you stay on track, keep that visibility, and make commitments for the next meeting, you'll achieve 90%. And this is how strategy needs to go hand in glove with the tactics. Robert, tell us what's necessary for successful strategic planning.
Well, we've talked about quite a few of these. First of all, the sound approach and the process. And that's one of the reasons why we do what we do with the simplified strategic planning process, because that's a process that we have tested and experimented with and tuned over 30 years in all kinds of different businesses, and we think it works very well for companies like your own. The second thing you need is a commitment of your top management team to both support the process, the resources required, and also to be accountable for their own support and participation in the execution. The third thing you need is integration into your management process. So just as Denise talked about with the strategic management cycle, we don't want to view planning as an entirely independent activity. It's good to get off-site to do your strategic planning, but you want to directly link the results of your strategic planning to how people are going to do your day-to-day work, because that's where reality actually happens in your business. The fourth thing you need is enthusiasm. You certainly need good planning leadership, as I mentioned earlier, and you want to make sure that you spend an appropriate amount of time and money on the process. So this is an area that if you do it well, you can definitely get big payoff. So Denise, can you now talk about some other things relating to the strategic plan and how it's the key to success?
Well, one of the things we find is that you need a really good process, and if you find your process isn't setting you up to make decisions because you're making decisions based on opinion versus facts, or you don't have a consistent approach to research, so you're getting a lot of data, but you're not getting consistent data on each market segment or each competitor. Or if in fact you're finding that it's all top of mind thinking, so whatever happened, in the last month is getting approached without really giving people time to think through what's most important. Or you don't have an analysis funnel which really allows people to think through what's most important and talk about it among the group so the important things bubble up. We'd like to make this offer to you, and that's the Simplified Strategic Planning Seminar. So if your strategic planning isn't working and you'd like to really look at your process and use some of the tools that many people have found effective, we'd like to offer this to the people who attend this webinar at a special price of $9.95. And you can see the link here where you'll be able to see that price, and you'll receive an email after this webinar. If you're listening to an archived version of this presentation, please call Elizabeth Tidd, and she can help you out with that. In addition, if you do have questions, we do in-house workshops and consultings, but let's take a turn now for questions. Does anyone have any questions from what Robert and I have discussed? And type your questions into the question box, and I've got one question here right now, and that is, Robert, you mentioned not focusing on consensus. Could you help me explain what you mean by this?
Well, I find that when people are trying to get consensus at with no object other than getting consensus, what they end up doing is compromising between all the different views in the room. And let me give you an example of where this can lead you very much astray. Those of you who've either read any of our books or been to our seminar know that one of the clear strategies you need to have in most organizations is a sense of whether you're targeting specialty or commodity customers. Specialty customers are people who will pay a little extra, but they really want the good stuff, whatever it is, or good service if you're in a service business. Commodity customers are people who decide primarily based on what's cheap. And those two behaviors are so different that if you try to create a consensus of people who think you should target one or the other in the room, you end up with this sort of middle-of-the-road result, which means, I mean, if you think about it in terms of retailers, you're not going to be Neiman Marcus, but you're also not going to be Walmart. You're going to be J.C. Penney or one of those other sort of middle-of-the-road retailers that's in real trouble right now.
Okay, someone did type in a question. If you could retype it in, that would be excellent, because it's some, okay. Hold on, let me get it. What are some of the main differences for strategic planning for not-for-profits? Robert, would you like to take that, or would you like me to take that?
If you want to take it, that's great. My sense is not-for-profits still have, I mean, they still need metrics for success. They need to define what they're trying to accomplish, and they still have resource issues, and efficiency can be a difficulty because it's hard to measure outcome versus the resources put in. But it's still a very usable process, strategic planning. You just need to think in terms of driving effectiveness rather than strictly profitability. Do you have anything to add to that, Denise?
Yeah, I find that the process works very well for not-for-profits. Once again, you do make some changes in terms of not necessarily driving for profit and effectiveness, as Robert has mentioned, but where I find it really works is it allows a not-for-profit to get all choices out there at once and make choices. And unfortunately, that means saying no to some things, but it allows everybody to have an opinion, voice their opinion. It allows people to do research. And what I've found with the not-for-profits I've worked with is it really then allows them to focus their resources and become much more effective.
Excellent. I noticed there were a couple of other questions in the question box. One of them was about applying the strategy ideas to a virtual business, and the answer there is there really isn't that much of a difference. Your main difficulty, and it depends on the number of people involved, may be actually getting all of the people together to share ideas and develop the strategy. But I find that virtuality doesn't change the effectiveness of strategic planning. In fact, you could argue that Center for Simplified Strategic Planning has a lot of virtual aspects. We have people who work for CSSP all over the country who sometimes don't even see each other once a year. So we're definitely understanding of that, and it's quite useful. If you're very small, you have to encompass all this stuff in a smaller number of people, obviously.
All right. Once again, please type in your questions, and if I missed your question, and I do think I missed one, if you could retype it, that would be excellent. I see another question for me regarding implementation. Someone asked, what are some of the common problems? So some of the common problems I see are when people are doing monitoring, they play the blame game rather than coming up with a solution. So in a monitoring process, you're going to have action plans, and some of them will be on track, some of them not on track. But often it is the team leader who needs to resolve the roadblock. So yes, that would be a true statement. But it is also the rest of the team to talk about ways that you can help that person remove those roadblocks so they're not out there on an island. So it's a team problem-solving meeting rather than just a reporting meeting. Another thing I've seen is sometimes I see people declaring victory before they've actually achieved the strategic objective. And so this is when you're looking to a new product launch to generate $10 million worth of revenue at 20% margin, and you declare victory when you launch the product. And so you never really are looking to get that money, so you're not making the tweaks and perhaps you need to make in the marketing material. Or perhaps the product is arriving damaged and you need to change the packaging. Or perhaps there's a profitability issue, and now that you have volume, you can go through alternative sourcing so you get better pricing. So that's another thing I see on implementation, for people to say, okay, we've launched the product or we're done, but we really haven't achieved the result that we were intending. Good. Any other questions out there? All right. Well, we've been very excited having you on this. I know that sometimes strategic planning can be a challenge. Robert and I enjoy everything that we do. We are more than happy to talk to you if you have had a specific problem with your strategic planning. We have our contact information here, both our email addresses and our phone numbers, and we'd be happy to answer any questions one-on-one that you have. Once again, thank you for listening to our webinar.